Hello, and welcome to OVA Hour number 6. I'm Jennifer Garrison. I'm an assistant professor here at the Buck Institute for Research on Aging, and I'm delighted to be here again. A few years ago, the Buck Institute launched a moonshot effort to tackle female reproductive aging. With the help from the Biomarkers Foundation, we opened a center at Buck to explore this understudied topic of ovarian aging and reproductive health, and how they directly impact a woman's health, her lifespan, her career, everything. As a society, every aspect of a woman's life is influenced by the fact that her reproductive capacity is limited. Family planning, career decisions, overall health, and this is truly an area that is understudied. So the center was the first in the world to focus on this topic, and to strengthen and broaden our reach, we started a global consortium, which is building an intellectual network of academia, biotech thought leaders, ambassadors from all over the world, VCs, anyone who has an interest in the space, essentially. And what we're trying to do is to accelerate and facilitate translating basic scientific discoveries into products and therapies that are going to improve women's lives. So as part of building this amazing network, I get to talk to incredible people every single day working in the space. And so I'm excited to introduce you to some of those people here on the OVA webinar for discussions about building out this ecosystem. So today, we are fortunate to have back Lizellen La Follette. She's a globally recognized board-certified OBGYN. She's a leader, an educator, a researcher, and she focuses on comprehensive healthcare for women. She also happens to be a member of the global consortium. So welcome, Lizellen.
Thank you. Happy to be here again.
So today we want to talk about biomarkers, diagnostics, and clocks for female reproductive aging. So we talk a lot about how, reproductive function is maybe one of the most complex and multivariate signatures in all of human health. How a woman's fertility and her reproductive span isn't really like a bank that goes in one direction. It's stochastic, it's cyclical, and it varies dramatically between individual women, right?
Right. And I think one of the things we have to understand is because it's each individual woman's journey, we have to make sure that we don't use broad sweeping generalizations that are discouraging.
Right. So I wanted to pop this slide up here, which we've shown before, but for those of you who haven't tuned in before, this is a chart of egg quality and quantity over time. So looking at a woman's age on the bottom and the number of eggs and the quality of eggs on the side. And this is a chart that women are made to believe is absolute truth, right?
Right.
That this is what's happening, that there's really nothing that we can do about it. But I have to say, I think this is an inaccurate model, and that we've been stuck in this idea that there's this cliff that we can't do anything about. But in fact, each woman has her own unique model.
Right.
So the question that every woman asks me, Lizellen,
yes, and me, right,
is how can I find out where I am on this curve and what my trajectory looks like?
All right. So before I answer that question, I want to bring up the moonshot idea. One of the best things about this consortium is that technology is impacting science. And technology, with all of the benefits that it's brought, not the least of which is money, it allows us to actually look at questions and have the funding to be able to do it. Mm-hmm. So, for example, people in this building at the Buck are right now talking to the science people at NASA to be able to recognize how they can live outside of this planet. And if you think about the names of the people, SpaceX, Blue Origin, their names are not women's names, right? It's not Josephina Bezos. It's not Elon Musk. But what if it were? And that's what we want to have into this group. This is the kind of information and the kind of interest we want. Let us take those interests and those people and focus it on how does the human species reproduce and how can we live better and longer. So let's talk about some of the things that make a huge difference in terms of statistics. This particular book, Expecting Better, is a book by a woman who's a professor at Brown in economics. She felt, interestingly enough, and I think she's completely true, Emily Oster, that we do not have good data on our whole reproductive window in terms of looking at that chart. Mm-hmm. For example, women who got married in their 30s, 35, 39, 40, 45, even women that tried to conceive between 40 and 45, the vast majority, over 50%, conceived within a year. So this idea that this cliff all of a sudden happens and you're never going to conceive, even women 45 and higher, 14% of those people conceive. So if you can imagine that this is a gradual curve and that there clearly are going to be some things in terms of how we live our lives that may impact it, and then each one of us is different, then we have a chance to actually make a difference. But the idea that we have no control over this is a very negative one, and I don't think realistic. I think we have some things we can do to make a difference.
Okay, all right. So tell me, if I come into your office and I'm a young woman, I'm not trying to get pregnant.
Right.
What are the things that you can do to tell me about my fertility, about where I am along this trajectory?
So I'll start with a quick story, because after all, when we look back on these particular seminars, and this, by the way, is OVA number 6, which I love, is that we have just come through a pandemic. And as of today, the Bay Area and hopefully the country, Thursday, today, November 4th, right? It's hard to believe we're already in November, actually is rolling out vaccines for kids between 5 and 12.
Right.
Thank goodness. We're now going to get these wonderful kids that are able to actually not be stuck in front of Zoom, but actually in real life schooling to be able to be vaccinated. Finally, you think of how long that's taken. Right, so if you look at the COVID situation in terms of what are we trying to do immunologically, we're trying to not get COVID, right? One could say that. One could go back in time and say we're trying to escape the woolly mammoth. And for a patient who is young, who comes into me and says, my college is requiring me to get the COVID vaccine, I hear it changes my menstrual cycle. And the answer is, you bet it does. And not only have we known this for ages, but we know that hormones decrease when you have a biologic threat that is going to affect your livelihood. COVID, woolly monster, pick one, depending on where you are in the centuries. You cannot have a kid, you cannot get pregnant if you are fighting some dread disease that is going to take your life. So yes, does COVID vaccine affect the menstrual cycle? Yes, so when a young woman comes to me and asks me, should they be vaccinated? I said yes. And yes, it'll affect your menstrual cycle slowly, shortly, maybe only 2 months worth. But, NIH has now gotten a big grant or asked for studies for 1.4 million, but we already know this data. This is hormonal data we know. But so when I ask them, it's like, okay, you're young, you're trying not to get pregnant. How old were you when you first got your periods?
Okay.
What are your menstrual cycles like? What other problems are going on? Are you heavy? Is your blood pressure okay? What other things are going to make a difference? Not because we're trying to ask the question of fertility, but eventually that question will come.
Okay, so you're looking at what's happening now. How long are your cycles? What's happening with your menstrual history? Basically, collecting a baseline.
Collecting a baseline
Okay.
that I know if I'm lucky enough to take care of her over time, it'll come back when 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, she wants to conceive.
Okay, what about things like metabolic markers?
So it's an interesting question. We still are using the menstrual cycle as our metabolic marker.
Okay.
So we still use the cyclic, as you can see, the cyclic cycle.
pull that chart
Yes,
up.
thank you. As you can see on your slide, on your next slide, that we're still using the idea that the menstrual cycle is telling us something about the fertility, the ovulation development, as well as hormonal fluxes.
So take me through this just quickly.
Yes. So if you think about the first half of the cycle, the whole part of this orange line is corresponding with development of the egg. So we're creating a follicle, the follicle is growing, 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 it gets to a certain size, hormonal environment changes, and boom, you release the egg, right? So that's that orange line up to ovulation. Estrogen then falls, progesterone then starts to increase to create a uterine lining where if that egg happens to meet sperm, it can land in an environment in the uterus that actually will get its implant. And hence the progesterone cycle then is the sort of secondary peak there in the green. And then if that doesn't happen, then you will get another menstrual cycle.
Okay, and we put this picture of the brain and the ovaries up here on the left because we wanted to remind you that, these things are a conversation between the brain and the reproductive organs. So LH and FSH are signaling from the brain to the ovaries, and estrogen and progesterone are going in the opposite direction.
Right.
And this is a cycle, and this is just a tiny little snapshot of lots of different hormones that are being released by the brain, released by the ovaries, released by the uterus. And so There's a lot going on there. So it sounds like you're not really measuring a lot.
So not in a young woman, I'm not, because
Okay.
I don't need to know, and she doesn't need to know. Her big deal is how not to get pregnant, right? At that particular time. Now, fast forward 3 to 5 years, when she wants to ask the question, what's the first thing I do? I check him.
So
Right.
this is when a woman wants to conceive.
She wants
or
to
she's
conceive,
thinking she
or
wants to
she-
conceive in a few years.
in a few years.
So how do you measure her fertility for her?
So the first thing I do is that if she knows the partner and she knows that she wants to conceive with the partner, I check him. Right? That's easy. Semen analysis. Remember, infertility and fertility is a two-part deal. There's a male factor and a female factor, and we don't need to forget half of them. Right?
Okay.
So, all right, then let's assume that she wants to know. All right, it's not today, but maybe 3 years from now. I want to know whether or not actually everything looks like it's being primed. Well, okay, a couple things. Are you on birth control? That'll influence these assays and these questions. So maybe you need to first come off the birth control, recognizing that the 3 to 5 years could be tomorrow. So pay attention in terms of barrier methods that will not influence these measurements. And then I will do, if they want, and if they want to know, recognizing, as you pointed out, the randomness of each cycle. So although today your FSH and estradiol may be good, that's egg number 1 of today, 11/4/21. In December, guess what? It's going to be a different group because every month it's different.
Okay. But so what kind of measurements are you doing now? Are you measuring all of these things?
So I'm typically measuring estradiol, FSH. So the brain to the ovary message and the ovarian secretion message. And then the antral follicle count is a sonogram, so looking at how many follicles are around.
So let's go into that.
Yeah,
We're going to dig
here
a
we
little
go.
bit deeper in
Okay.
here. So there's lots of different stages of follicles that are developing the ovary, right? They're all named here. It's not really that important to understand, the differences between them. But it is important to understand that, at different stages of follicle development, those follicles will make different hormones that signal to the brain. So what is AMH?
So antimullerian hormone is basically limiting the formation of primary follicles, and it basically is clearing the road for the one dominant follicle to take
Right, because
over.
you don't want to have multiple follicles.
Right, and you try not to.
ovulate.
Although in your 30s and beyond, actually 35 and beyond, your chance of twinning is 2 to 3%. So everybody
And why
always
might that be? Is that because AMH levels go down?
Exactly. So there you go. You can see it. So we've now learned about twinning all in one day. We're really good. Okay. So and again, each cycle is different, but there it is. There's your AMH, and then this question of inhibin, which is to me relatively new thought. It actually may in fact give us some ideas in terms of menopause. That's another feedback loop that then is basically growing the follicle. And so if you think about it, you want to sort of get rid of the background noise, which is your AMH, right? Get rid of all these follicles all growing at the same time. Create a dominant one and let the dominant one grow.
So FSH is coming from the brain. It's stimulating follicular growth
Right.
and ovulation. But at the same time, then there are signals like AMH and inhibin coming back from the ovary to the brain to sort of regulate those things. And so inhibin B turns down FSH.
Right.
Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay. All right. So, and you're measuring all of these things?
I'm not measuring inhibin, and I sometimes will measure AMH and FSH and estradiol. But remember, this is a simplistic model, right? We're only looking at brain and ovary. What about everything else, right? So to me, this is our crude tools. This is what we got.
It is pretty crude. I mean, and as far as I can tell, at least from what you've said so far, it's not very comprehensive.
No.
So, AMH plasma levels, are they telling you anything about quality of
Not
eggs?
necessarily, no.
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 No. So they might be telling you something about how many follicles there are.
Right.
But not necessarily anything about the quality. Okay. What about other things for these women? Do you measure metabolic panels, other markers, nutrients?
So this is something I don't do, and I think it's an interesting question. Now, in fairness, if I have already established the history of them maybe having polycystic ovarian syndrome, in which they aren't ovulating monthly and their menstrual cycles are longer, again, we're using this indirect marker of the menstrual cycle to give us a question about their fertility, right? Then I might do a metabolic panel. I certainly will do another endocrine axis of thyroid. That I will do.
Tell me about the thyroid.
All right. So thyroid is basically regulating metabolism, and it impacts all sorts of things. And it clearly makes a difference in terms of having a normal thyroid level makes a difference in terms of fertility.
Okay.
The infertility doctors often will put somebody on a low dose, even if their thyroid is normal, to just optimize it. This question of optimization.
Okay, so yeah, this question of optimization is something that I think is really important. And I think for us, most of us are going to get a class at some point when we're like in junior high about the hormonal changes that happen during puberty, right?
Right.
And then some of us will get a talk about sex, but there's not really a time in our lives as mature adults when we're hearing any kind of education around fertility.
That's right.
And certainly nothing about menopause.
That's right. Exactly right.
So, okay, all right. So that's what you would do for a woman who is thinking about getting pregnant.
Yep.
So to me, that seems really incomplete. And am I mistaken in thinking that that is exactly the same set of markers that you would have measured in my mother?
Yes.
Or in my grandmother when they were...
And they're the same hormones I'm going to measure when you're perimenopausal and menopausal.
Okay.
So this is it. I mean, this is what we got.
That's it. Okay.
Yep.
So is it fair to say that we don't have very good tools?
Yes, it's very fair to say. That is not on a stretch by any
and I shouldn't be laughing. This is serious. It's horrific that we don't have something better than this.
I think one of the most important things is that the human species only works if we're able to have kids, right? So this whole discussion about fertility does not become a woman's versus a men's issue. It becomes a humanity issue. Mm-hmm. How is it that we as humans do not feel this is the most important? I mean, I'm all for space travel, but could you just work on day-to-day making sure that the next generation of brilliant humans come out? I mean, that to me is much more important.
Right. Okay, so I want to break the rest of this talk down then into two parts. One is, okay, what do we have that's available that could be measured now that we're not measuring?
Right.
And then what needs to be done in terms of the science,
Perfect.
right? Because clearly we need to do more research around this space. And I will say to, the entrepreneurs out there, this is a problem that I think is solvable today. And so, for those of you out there who have an entrepreneurial spirit, I'm asking you to step in here.
You bet.
So the lowest hanging fruit, the easiest thing to do from my perspective is to think about what other metrics we can measure, either in blood or in urine, or any sort of non-invasive procedures we can do to give a woman a much better picture of where she is, not just in her fertility, but also in terms of her reproductive span. So you said that for a woman who comes in who's potentially approaching menopause, you would use exactly the same measurements.
I would use the same measurements.
Okay. So there's this idea that women's health in general has been neglected over time, right? And that we need to look at women kind of as a holistic whole. Right. Meaning that, whether you're concerned about fertility or menopause or anything in between, that really what you want to do is optimize every single part of a woman's physiology.
That's correct.
Right?
If you think about it, just improving our health span. Now, if you think about that first slide that you showed that had the brain and uterine sort of connection, what about all the rest of the organ? What about everything else in your body? It's not just a single track, goes brain to ovary. I mean, hello, there's a few things in between.
There are some other things in between, right? Okay, so, all right, so if we were dreaming up, let's say, a combination of blood and urine diagnostics that we could measure among already existing tests, and package it as like a reproductive health diagnostic panel for women or something like that.
Yes.
What would that include?
Well, I mean, I think one of the most important things has to do with what's your overall health? What are the other markers of your health that make a difference?
Okay, so what are those? And what can we measure right now?
So we can measure glucose metabolism, so the metabolic panel. We can measure thyroid. We talked about that.
Okay.
And we may be able to look at things of metabolic that may make a difference. What are you absorbing? What other things are in your body right currently and in your GI tract and other places that will make a difference in terms of impacting your overall health, which in turn will likely impact your reproductive fertility.
Okay, so things like nutrients?
Yes.
What else? Antioxidants, fatty acids?
Sure, all that stuff.
Oxidative stress markers?
Right, exactly. Things that'll make a difference in terms of your health. Right? How does your immune system work and how is it working optimally to be able to conceive.
So do we have markers for things like, we have liver function and kidney
Right,
function,
we do.
obviously. What about gut health? Do we have markers for gut health?
Not yet, we don't. I mean, we're
Okay.
starting to learn about this. And this is,
Okay.
I would say, the greatest black box of medicine is to understand how the entire gut impacts the rest of our body.
Okay, all right. What about things like stress? So we know that, especially when a woman is trying to conceive, that stress can be a real inhibitor of things like that. So how do we measure stress?
If you look at what's happened in the pandemic, in which everyone has basically had to work from home, and then you allow people to spend an awful lot of time online, one of the anxiety-producing things that adds to women's stress is reading every single story that ever came out about how nobody was able to conceive in 2020 because of COVID, right? So guess what, guys? That's not true. Everybody's still conceiving. You know, people are still actually able to have kids in this crazy time. But I think that the stress factor of worry and the information that is coming back is not diluted in terms of good information versus just what's out there. And I think we have a tendency in general to sort of just focus on the negative. And in fairness, we don't have a lot to really help them move forward, yet anyway, in terms of understanding other parts of your body and your reproductive cycle.
Okay. Are there any other things that you can think of? What about methylation markers?
I think anything that involves both in terms of proteins and in terms of absorption and in terms of stress markers, whether it's cortisol, all that stuff. Again, you know, if you're running away from the woolly mammoth, which in this case is COVID, you sure as heck are going to have less testosterone and you're probably going to have less estrogen, both of which will directly impact your fertility, right? So, but if you're starting to look at, are there factors in the immune system like methylation that basically takes your immune system on a path the wrong way? You bet. Some of that stuff's going to make a difference. We should be able to look at that. Have we? Not yet. Not certainly in medicine. Maybe in basic science.
Okay, all right. So we just talked about what could constitute, I imagine, hundreds of metrics that we could measure in blood. Which of those would you measure in urine? Or would you measure any of those in urine?
Well, I think the thing that's so interesting about the urine is it allows people to do something daily. If you think about this idea of the random and stochastic cycle, if you look at a cycle, you really would like to be able to take 200 women and be able to say, okay, let's look at them daily. And let's look at what's happening to their hormones and what's happening to their gut and what's happening to their immune markers and what's happening to their overall inflammation. What are the things that may impact their stress, right? But if you're trying to do it every day, that means a blood draw every day.
That seems impossible.
Yes, I agree. It's a little, and a lot, very invasive.
Okay.
So urine could then become something easy, all right? So are there other, basically, bodily fluids that'll give us some of this information? So urine's one of them.
So there are available tests. I know one is called Dutch dried urine test for comprehensive hormones, I think.
Right.
Which is collected spots on a filter paper. So it's not like a huge volume, and it's something where you could collect over multiple days.
Right.
And that allows you to measure hormones.
Right.
Right. And particularly things like estrogen, progesterone, testosterone.
Right.
Can you measure other things that way?
You should be able to, right?
Yeah.
That's
Things like cortisol.
exactly the stress component and maybe even some of the gut components. in
Right,
terms
so
of
that could be
inflammation.
really powerful in terms of monitoring things that are known to have circadian or pulsatile functions that are known to change dramatically over the course of a woman's cycle.
Right.
And maybe even to check within a day, right, what's happening. Okay, so there's that.
Right.
And then what about these other measures that you were talking about that you already do? So in terms of like AMH, for example.
Right.
There's a lot of controversy around whether AMH is actually a very good measure of things like reproductive capacity in the short term, but also in terms of reproductive span, in terms of whether or not a woman's fertility is declining with age.
Right.
So are there ways to maybe make that more robust?
Right, so that the idea of looking at the eggs on an ultrasound, the antral follicle count. So anti-Mullerian hormone, which is AMH, right, is looking at sort of one spot in time, right? But antral follicle count is the dynamic capture of all of the follicles that have been told, not you guys, and the chief follicle that says you're going for the chief goddess follicle that's going to ovulate, right? I mean, you think about it that way. And then you're able to actually look at where you are in terms of the development and to say, gee, if I have a lot of background noise, namely there's a lot of follicles here, I know that I'll be able to pick the chief follicle who's going to go ahead and be the goddess in terms of being ovulated, right? So if you think about it that way, it actually makes it a much more robust test because you're looking at physiologically in terms of the patient. It's an ultrasound. It's a vaginal ultrasound. So it's not nothing, right? Mm-hmm. Combining with the hormones to try to get you a better picture of how this dynamic system, which changes every month, can give us an idea of whether or not it's something that can work easily.
Okay, so antral follicle count and AMH, inhibin B, LH-FH ratios, which maybe tell you a little bit more about what's happening than any one individually. But the bottom line is still that, we're still left with the metrics that are not a great option, even though the combo is better than individually.
That's correct.
Okay. All right, so coming back to our theoretical reproductive health diagnostic panel for women.
Yes.
It sounds to me like we would be combining a bunch of tests that are maybe already available from LabCorp or Quest or any of these blood testing companies, but that the key would be to take blood tests from all of these metrics that we just talked about and compile them and analyze them, right, into either one metric or, maybe a couple of metrics that would give a woman some idea about where she was in terms of, her overall health and her overall physiology, right? So that you could kind of like understand in a diagnostic way which parts of the system are underperforming and maybe think about why. Which pathway or system requires a little bit more attention.
Right, exactly.
And maybe empirically change something small, lifestyle changes, things like that, to potentially improve overall health. But in doing that, right, if you improve, the environment in which an egg is developing, that's likely to also improve your chances of having a healthy egg. And so, of course, what we're talking about are not going to, that's not going to address underlying dysfunction. Or disease, but it might actually help you uncover some of those things.
That's correct.
Right?
And if you think about it, we shouldn't limit ourselves. I mean, since we really only have 3 tools right now, the answer is let's open it up. Let's use, artificial intelligence. Let's use all the math that we can do to figure out if any of these systems work. So let's not be picky about what system we need to look at. We need to look at your head. We need to look at your thyroid. We need to look at your heart. We need to look at your vascular system. We need to look at your gut. We need to look at your kidneys. We need to look at your ovaries and your uterus, right? So why be limited? Now, I recognize that, remember, we are trying to create a perfect diagnostic tool, which we do not have. So I wouldn't cut anything out yet. We just don't know.
All right. So there are a few companies that do something like this that will take a lot of metrics and provide a single comprehensive report. One of them is called Genova Diagnostics, but there are others.
Yes.
And the idea would be to make something even better than that and maybe tailor it to change with the age of the patient, right? Because the things that you might be concerned about in a young woman would be really different from the things that you'd be interested in knowing for someone who's approaching the age of perimenopause.
That's correct.
Right?
That's correct.
And so what do you do now for women who are, approaching menopause who want to know something about where they are in their trajectory?
So exactly the same as I was doing when they're trying to figure out their fertility, right? I'm still looking at the brain message to the ovary. How hard is it for you to create an egg? So FSH and estradiol, and then AMH, and probably inhibin, because that's actually, there's some really nice studies that suggest inhibin.
Oh, yeah.
We have to talk on that.
Right?
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think inhibin B is interesting because there's been a couple of studies showing that in the year before menopause, that it completely goes away. So that's one way to know that you're getting close.
Right, exactly.
To measure that.
You have to measure it, right?
And you have to have a baseline, too,
yes, exactly.
right? So you have to actually know where you were.
Right.
So all of these things require, I think, a lot more interaction with your physician than maybe most women are having right now.
Right.
Okay, all right. So that would be our dream.
Right.
With the things we have now. But again, this is still
moonshot.
This is still just what we're talking about is just it's still, I think, kind of small. So what else needs to happen?
Well, I mean, I think one of the questions is that what other things do we have? I mean, I think one of the things is we all look at chronologic age, and one of the things that first slide showed us is that even though your fertility window may change over time, it still is pretty robust beyond 40. And more than 50% of the people conceive beyond 40. Now, one of the problems with the way everybody is funneled in terms of being able to access the infertility doctors, they don't see the miracles that I see every day. And one of the problems is you're viewed as, oh my gosh, my fertility is falling off a cliff at 35. It actually isn't.
It may not be.
It may not be. In fact, probably isn't. But they're only seeing the subset of people that say, well, now my tech company is going to cover my infertility, so why not do it? And I'm like, because you might be able to do this without a lot of intervention. So
Okay, so what's something that's maybe like on the cutting edge that is available now, but most people don't know about? I think, you mentioned chronologic age, which is, what it says on your driver's license. But I think a lot of people maybe don't realize that you sort of have two ages, right? There's the one that you've been tracking as you've traveled around the sun and on your driver's license. But there's the other, which we call biologic age, which you may or may not be aware of, but which is essentially like tracking the way your cells have changed as you've been alive, right? So, and knowing that biological age is maybe an effective way of determining your cumulative rate of aging, right?
yes, I mean, I think that one of the things we talk about in terms of ages, right? So you look at the biologic, you look at the chronologic, you may be able to look at the inflammatory. You have all these ideas of what the time is not the factor, it's the function. So we really want a functional age, right, if you think about it, that then we can impact, and like that would be exercise, that would be diet, that would be, not smoking, right?
Right. It's like a cumulative snapshot of everything about you, your genetics, your lifestyle, demographics, diet, exercise, all of your habits together.
Right, exactly.
All right. Okay. And so how do we measure biological age? Well, there's a lot of different ways. There are several different clocks, so to speak, that are out there. I would say the most well-known and maybe the most robust in terms of having been tested is the DNA methylation clock, right? So there's a lot of compounds and things, proteins, sugars, lots of things that can attach to your DNA, right? And those modifications tell your DNA what to do, whether to turn on, whether to turn off, to make this protein or that protein. And in some parts of your genome, methylation changes very precisely with age. And so you can measure DNA methylation and get a pretty good snapshot of what your biological age is across tissues, right? So that's one way.
So wait, so when you're talking about, explain that a little bit to me, the methylation of DNA, right? So that's considered to be a bad thing. Is that the way you're measuring it?
No.
Okay, good. Okay.
No.
Explain that to me, right?
There's
So
lots of different marks on your
good.
DNA.
Okay,
Lots
good.
of things
Okay,
mark
thank
up your
you.
DNA.
Good.
Your DNA is not naked. It's marked up.
Okay, fine.
It's marked up with lots of different things.
good.
And then methyl groups are one chemical modification that can happen to DNA. And it just so happens that people have discovered that when and where your DNA is marked with methylation, changes across age in a very reproducible way.
Oh, nice. Okay.
And so you can correlate it not just with your biologic age, but also with age-related diseases. So it's a pretty good clock.
Nice. All right. That's terrific.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not something that most physicians recommend.
Right.
And it is, it's not covered by insurance. These are things that we have to change.
And how hard is it to measure your DNA methylation?
Not hard at all.
Okay. Nice. Okay, that's good to know. So
Not hard to take a sample to do
Right,
that,
okay, good.
right?
Okay.
There are other kinds of clocks. You mentioned, looking at your immune system.
Yes.
There's lots of different clocks that exist. One that has been shown, at least in preliminary studies, to actually have some correlation with reproductive span, which I think is super interesting for this audience,
Yes.
is your glycan clock.
Right.
So glycans are sugar molecules that surround and sometimes modify the proteins in your body. And they change based on lifestyle, based on diet, based on inflammatory state of your immune system. And that's another way to measure biological age. And it turns out that they are, in very preliminary studies, they've looked at links between menopausal status and biological age using basically your glycan status. So there's a company called Glycan Age that's doing some really exciting work in this space.
Which is really exciting, because if you're able to do this, and again, by drawing blood or urine, whichever, I don't know which way they're actually measuring this, if you're looking at it in terms of the impact of your immune system, right, in terms of both inflammation and optimization of your immune system, the way I always look at the way to actually get to our best selves is to imagine that we have optimized our immune system in all these different ways, whether it's DNA methylation, whether it is glycan, whether it is exercise, whether it is, decreasing stress. All of that will contribute to a better immune system. A better immune system eventually, hopefully, will be part of this biologic, marker that we're looking at, that will be able to help us then look at reproduction, which has got to be all part and parcel together.
All right, okay, so, all right, where are we at here?
Research.
Research, yes. We're missing a huge amount of information here, right? So we've talked through everything that's possible right now, from clocks to, doing a female reproductive health diagnostic panel, which would include, hundreds of measurements that we could do in blood and urine over time and measure hormones.
Yes, we're not cutting anything off, so we're going full.
No, we
full
should
board.
take advantage of what's available now, but we should also think hard about what we need.
Right.
And I would say we need something better.
Yes, clearly. We need a lot better, but we'll
Much
take
better.
what we can get.
So, one of the things that I'm really proud of for the consortium is that we have been funding grants to basic scientists to do research in this space, right? And the goal is truly to understand what causes ovarian aging, and in doing that, to try to understand how we might be able to intervene to either slow it down, stop it, or maybe even reverse it. That would be the moonshot.
Fabulous. That would be the moonshot.
But understanding what causes it is what will give us, the things that we're hoping for.
Right.
Along the way, we would really love to have better diagnostics, better biomarkers, better ways to understand not just a woman's fertility, but also where she is in her individual reproductive span trajectory. Until we can get rid of menopause, we want everyone to understand where they are.
Right. But I think one of the things that's really important is the window of ovarian function and its change is giving us a heads up about aging. And it allows us to be able to then translate that aging in terms of the health span. So we have the luck of being able to have a window into this ahead of everything else.
That's exactly right. So I think what you're saying is that ovaries, because they age prematurely, right? They age at 2.5, 3 times the rate of the rest of the body.
Exactly.
And they're geriatric, or they're considered, kind of kaput by a woman's mid-30s. Because they age precociously, we can use them as a model to study aging in the rest of the body. And that is exactly right. All of the pathways that we've discovered that are important for aging in the rest of the body also operate in the ovaries, but just at an accelerated rate. So if we can figure out why ovaries age fast, we'll have figured something out about aging in the rest of the body. And so that's important not just for women, but also for men.
Yes, for everybody.
And if you think about it, ovaries could be a really great model for clinical research.
No, exactly.
Right?
It is the first opportunity to be able to use it in terms of aging anyway. And so that should be our center of asking, because it's right in front of us, it's changing.
Yeah.
And it's changing faster than the rest of us. So it should be our sort of, starting point.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to talk about some of the research that we funded that really impacts the sort of things that we've been talking about today.
Perfect.
So first I wanted to point out these awesome scientists, Zita Santos and Carlos Ribeiro, who are at Champollion in Portugal. So we funded a grant for them to look at the relationship between metabolic reprogramming, dietary nutrients, and food cravings on ovarian aging. Right? So looking at essentially the relationship between metabolism and ovarian aging. And not just, how diet impacts aging, but are there changes that somebody could make? Are there dietary interventions, like simple lifestyle changes that might improve fertility or slow down reproductive aging? So this is super exciting.
Yes.
And I think, we've got a lot of work to do, but they're doing some really cool research.
Well, I think if you think about it from the perspective is we are what we eat, right?
Right.
And if then you take it to we are what we eat in terms of the next generation, right? So if we all just did broccoli and kale, we'd probably all be, some of this stuff would make a bigger difference and actually help us. But I think the other part has to do with we know diet influences specifically related to polycystic ovarian syndrome,
Right.
in which the sugar metabolism basically affects ovulation. And if we impact the sugar metabolism by putting an form in some of these medicines that'll make a difference in terms of your sugar metabolism, you allow the patient to ovulate.
Right.
So one of our early crude tools of people that had polycystic ovarian syndrome, which many people have, right? There's a huge umbrella of the syndrome, was to be able to impact ovarian function through basically metabolics.
And so when someone comes in with PCOS, what do you do? Do you try to intervene? Do you tell them to change what they're eating? What do you do?
Well,
I know we covered this in another webinar, but let's just revisit.
I'll just typically say that polycystic ovarian syndrome is the ability to create all of the follicles. So if you think about it, so your anti-Mullerian is there and your inhibin is there, but you haven't been able to actually get a dominant follicle out. So you have this sort of capsule around the ovary. And that turns out to actually be influenced by metabolics, by sugar, right? So if you're able to, when somebody comes into me and says, I want to get pregnant and I'm not ovulating, right? So the first thing we can do is, how do we impact ovulation? In someone like that, we look for the constellation, we do the ultrasound, we do the constellation of all these follicles around the edge of the ovary, and then we say we have two ways to do it. We can get you, as a weak brain message to your ovary, to ovulate, and that's going to be the brain-ovary axis, or we can do the metabolic axis, which is decrease your blood sugar, add metformin, and see if that gets you to ovulate.
And that helps.
And it not only helps, but it's easier.
Right. Okay. All right. So we already know that
Yes,
that
makes a big
metabolism
difference.
influences ovarian function, and they're working on extending that study.
Which is fabulous.
So, thinking about dietary intervention, I mean, it really all comes down to the microbiome.
Yes.
Which is, something that is really exciting and interesting. And so we funded Minhoo Kim at the University of Southern California to look at the effects of microbiome on reproductive aging. So there are lots of studies that have shown a functional relationship between the gut microbiome and ovarian function, right? And it's kind of mind-blowing when you step back and think about it, that the adult human gut microbiome has something like 10 to 100 trillion microorganisms in it. Right? Those numbers exceed the number of human cells by more than tenfold. So
this is where you get into advanced math. This is your artificial intelligence. Because right now there's so much data, it's sort of like, how do we get there?
Right. And obviously they must be smaller than our cells, or else they wouldn't all fit in our gut.
Yes, good point.
But the human gut microbiome has been shown to metabolize estrogen substrates, which blows my mind.
Yes.
Right? So it can regulate the concentration of circulating estrogen in the bloodstream. And there's been a study that showed that if you transplant microbial species that are extracted from patients who have PCOS
Yes, there we go.
and put them into mice, that induces ovarian dysfunction in those mice. So there's clearly something happening here. We don't fully understand what it is, but we're super excited for Minhoo, and she's a postdoctoral fellow, so she's an up-and-coming scientist.
fantastic.
She's one of those young scientists that we're trying to seed the field with. She's working in the lab of Berenice Benayoun, who's also working on sex differences in aging and reproductive aging, and she's making a model for menopause. It's really awesome what's going on
Wonderful.
there.
But if you think about this microbiome of the gut, right? So now we have the brain, and now we have the gut as part of our axes that we need to be analyzing in terms of actually making a difference, in terms of both the menstrual cycle, but also the reproductive cycle. So that to me is so powerful.
Yeah.
And there's so much data that obviously it's going to take a lot of math to do that.
Yeah, and what we've been talking about this whole hour is, thinking about how can we find a better clock, either one clock or many clocks, that will help us understand where someone is in their reproductive span. And so we also funded a grant to Colleen Murphy at Princeton University. So right now, as we just talked about, it's really not possible for a woman to know where she stands on the scale of like age-related, say quality decline, as well as, thinking about like simple short range or long range biomarkers. We just don't have that. So she's proposing to try to understand differences between markers in the blood and markers in the reproductive tissues over time. looking for things that change in the same age window so that she might be able to find things that will predict age-related oocyte quality decline, and also identify changes that are going to be reflected in reproductive tissues, right? As a way for us to have much better clocks and much better information to give women, right?
But again, this whole idea that you're using the reproductive changes as an insight into aging in general. And that this, if we could get a handle on this, it may not just be for to understand where we are in our reproductive cycle. It may actually be a tool we can use for health span and aging in general.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's something that, if you can use a clock to measure ovarian decline, it could tell you something about the rest of the body.
You, yes.
And, if you stop and think about how are we going to go forward from here, right? There's so much work being done to try to understand mechanisms of aging and to develop aging interventions. How do you test those? Right?
Exactly.
If you're talking about human lifespan, how do we test those right now?
Right.
We've got worms and mice and flies
and we need humans.
mole rats,
right? Exactly,
and cells in a dish and dogs,
right?
and other creepy crawlies.
Yeah.
We've got lots of ways
Flies.
to measure in other organisms, but if we wanted to measure in humans, we would basically need a time machine.
Yes, exactly.
Right? So we would need a time machine, and we would need to.
Yes, we need a time machine. We need artificial intelligence. We need everybody working on it together, and and then we do not limit ourselves to the questions. Right? And that's, I think, really important.
So imagine if you could do a clinical trial that had an endpoint looking at ovarian aging.
Right.
So, there are endpoints that are very easy to measure with ovaries.
Yep.
Things like, when we're talking about fertility, things like the ability to conceive.
Yep.
But if you're talking about menopause, things like bone density.
Yeah, exactly.
Very simple things. So you can imagine doing a clinical trial for something that was meant to be an aging intervention, and if it had an effect on a on a time point that was something like in the 2 to 5 year range, suddenly we would have information that relates to lifespan overall, because we mentioned this before, but maybe not in this webinar today, that a woman's reproductive span, the age at which she goes through menopause, is correlated with her overall lifespan, right? And so there's a strong link between lifespan and reproductive span.
Right. And I think one of the things that when a patient comes into me and is feeling badly about perimenopause and having night sweats and hot flashes, and I say to them, there is some really good data that if we start you on hormone replacement therapy, we may be actually prolonging your health span. This is the same idea.
Yeah.
We are now subphysiologically replacing. Because in the old days, you were 50 menopausal and you died. Okay, thank goodness we're not there. You spend half of your life after menopause. If you're spending half of your life after menopause, let it be good.
Yeah, let it be good, please. And I wanted to say, we're coming up on the end of the hour. If you have questions, please put them into the chat. We'll answer them here as much time as we have. We will answer them. There's one more project I wanted to talk about that we funded. So to be clear, we funded 22 researchers all over the world with these grants, and they cover every aspect of ovarian aging, but we're just talking about the ones that are related to biomarkers and diagnostics today. Thinking about your genes. Right? So Yushin Su and Sung-Soo Kim at Columbia University are working on trying to understand how your genes control reproductive aging. So essentially looking at age-related factors in your genetic code that drive pathogenic programs of gene expression. So thinking about looking at genome-wide association studies to try to understand what are the genetic factors that are going to determine the age at which a woman goes through menopause. Because remember, the age at which a woman goes through menopause is really reflective of just how variable this signature of health is, right? So what's the average age at menopause?
51.
51. But what's the window that's considered normal?
It's actually 40 to 60. I mean, it's an enormous window.
It's huge. It's huge. And so, trying to understand what genetic factors determine when in that window a woman goes through menopause, that's going to be really important for trying to understand, everything that predisposes women to reproductive aging, and maybe allow us to, identify new therapeutic targets, but also new biomarkers.
Exactly, which is
that
what
will
we
help
need.
us understand where a woman is in her reproductive trajectory.
This idea of the genes, explain that to me a little bit, because we now, so there's not a lot of new things in medicine, but one of them is, the idea of doing cell-free DNA in mom's bloodstream, because we are our children at some level. There's small genetic fragments of the genome of the fetus in your bloodstream, and that's called cell-free DNA. So that gives us an idea of the chromosomes, a small part of the genetic whole piece of the fetus. But in this case, we usually, when I talk to somebody about, their health span, I ask them, is there family history of cancers? And we have now had an enormous amount of research that we can actually look at silos of genetic contribution related to cancer. So in other words, most people have heard of the BRCA gene, but there's Lynch syndrome. There's these other syndromes of genes that we should be asking about and testing for. And my question is that a similar thing that this could be in terms of what they're looking at for the genes for?
Exactly. So BRCA1 is a gene.
Right.
And, actually it's an allele. So, we all have the same genetic code if we're human, right?
Exactly.
We share the same. But there are differences between you and I, right? Small differences. And they're differences that, can affect our health. They can, if I have a difference in one gene and you don't, we call that an allele, right?
Okay, fine,
A place where it's different inside of a gene.
Right.
And, my allele might predispose me to some disease that because you don't have it, you're not predisposed to that disease. That's what you're talking about with BRCA1. So that predisposes you to breast cancer and a host of other cancers.
That's right.
So, so what they're looking for is exactly that. They're looking for changes in your genes or even in your intergenic regions, the parts that don't. And how those correlate with age at menopause. So if you can find genes that impact when a woman goes through menopause, what age she is at when she goes through menopause, then that might give you some handle on which genes are important for reproductive aging. Does that make sense?
Yes. So this idea that not only could you find them, but then you might be able to act on them.
You can measure them. And you could just measure them too,
fine.
right?
Okay,
so start with measuring them.
Okay.
And then,
I'm ready to act.
And then
though.
use them as potential new therapeutic targets,
Good.
right?
Yes.
Terrific. So all of that. So it's just really exciting work that's going on, and we're so proud to have funded them.
Yes.
And I wanted to also point out that we did a webinar series last spring called Making Reproductive Longevity a Reality in collaboration with the Asian Center for Reproductive Longevity and Equality in Singapore.
Right.
And there's 10 episodes of that webinar.
Fantastic, yes.
And every episode has 2 of our grantees presenting the research. And we targeted this for people who are not scientists. So if you want to learn more about what these researchers are doing, please go watch those webinars.
Fantastic.
I think
information,
we've got a few minutes left.
Okay.
Are there questions that we can answer?
I think one of the nicest things about our creative clock of what we could eventually be able to do as biomarkers is like, okay, this is within our grasp. Let's try to have all these researchers work together to be able to actually impact people's lives in terms of asking these questions and getting some answers.
Okay. All right. So I see one question that maybe came in before the webinar. What are some of the metabolic markers that we can measure to tell me what's happening in my body right now?
All right, so the biggie, so metabolic markers can be thyroid, right? They can be blood sugar, hemoglobin A1C, which is a 3-month measurement of your fasting blood sugar.
Okay, so that's a long-term measurement.
Yes, exactly. Trying to figure out what other metabolic markers I could be looking at that may make a difference. Those are the biggies that I can think of right off the top of my head. But also when I start to talk to people about how to age well and to create sort of a longer health span, I do talk about exercise. I do talk about stress. If you think about it, we're not always stressed all the time at the same time. There are going to be episodes in which we're highly stressed, like, for example, before this talk. And, when the talk's done, we're actually probably both going to be feeling a lot better. So I think that...
What are you talking about?
So in terms of stress,
exactly.
But from the perspective of, if we were able to understand in a health span, the moments of sort of supreme stress and thereby impacting our immune system and decreasing or increasing our inflammation to make things go awry, if you think about that, then we would be able to impact those times with some of these other modalities, and some of them being measured.
Absolutely. We always want a pill, but it turns out that diet and exercise
Yes.
are probably more powerful than any of that combined.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's see. We've got a bunch of questions. So
Yes.
Afaf asks, in your opinions, what are the best frameworks to look at multifacets of stress, psychological, social, societal, etc.? Because as you said, women are individuals with, individual variation. Are there ways to look at the levels of resilience that boost our immune systems and counteract stress?
All right. Well, I'm gonna digress quietly in terms of the immune reaction to the COVID vaccine. All right. Now, one of the things we know about vaccines in general.
I'm suffering from that right now.
I know you are. Your immune system.
I just got my booster and I am so sick.
Right. So it turns out that women and men do not react the same, right? They don't react the same to influenza vaccines or to COVID vaccines. In fact, women have a much more robust immune response than men do, right? Now, if you look at the demographics about illness and death in terms of COVID, there were more men that died than women. So we need to understand why is it that we have this great response, of which you're feeling today, right? Your immune system
My immune system is really, really responding.
Right.
Yes.
Exactly. And how can we harness that and make it happen, or mute it a little bit in terms of times of stress in general?
So in addition to measuring cortisol, are there other things that we can measure in real time to give us a sense for how women are?
Well, it's a great question. I don't know. Our markers that we have that look at, inflammation and infection and stuff like that, like a blood count, that'll give us a sort of piece of it. But we don't have great markers about this stuff. And these are fleeting, right? So you really have to capture them at the time. And so how do we do that and not have you be in a continuous blood draw, or this is where the urine comes in, I think, in terms of being able to measure.
Right. That kind of leads into the next question, which will there be a day in the future when young girls, premenstrual, could learn about their biological profile for early prevention of undesirable fertility problems? And what might be helpful for that profiling?
Well, wouldn't that be great?
It would be,
So
all of these markers that we're talking about, the ones we're dreaming of.
Yes.
Presumably would be things that you could measure at any, and potentially would want to measure so that you would have a baseline.
That's right.
You could see a snapshot over time of your own sort of trajectory through this.
Right. I think one of the things that's so interesting was when premenstrual young women, and I don't see too many of them because after all I'm a gynecologist and they're usually talking about birth control, so they're mostly menstrual, right? But if you think about it, if you're able to have a conversation at a 17-year-old that may in fact give them the whole window into their future, wouldn't that be great?
Amazing. I feel like there's so many young women who don't know these things about their bodies, and that if they did, they would be able to take measures that I personally, as a young person, I was totally ignorant. And so there are things that I probably would have done differently.
Yes, of course.
Had I known all of this information when I was younger.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then the last question that we have is, to what degree can you delay perimenopause or menopause with dietary modifications?
Wow, great idea. So clearly we know the small window that we know is metabolic, right? So blood sugar, watching sugar intake, watching alcohol intake, which is 2 parts sugar and 1 part fat, right? So that will make a difference. Exercise, watching your weight, those things may in fact change.
Do you mean it's 2 parts sugar and 1 part fat in terms of its effect on your body?
Yes, and in terms of the negativity of it, right? So I think we always are thinking, especially since we're so close to the wine country, that a glass of wine is okay, and a glass of wine for many of us maybe. There are going to be some people that won't work.
This is a place where I mean, this is again, it's something that's not available to everyone, but there are now glucose monitors, real-time glucose monitors, where I can take a little patch and put it on my tummy, and I can have an app on my phone, and I can see when I'm eating something or drinking wine, I can see in real time what it does to my blood sugar. And what a glass of wine does to my blood sugar and what it does to yours,
yes, it's going to be different.
It's going to be totally different. And so one thing that I think has been really helpful for me personally is to wear a glucose monitor like that, not forever, but for a month or something like that.
Exactly.
And to see how different foods and different beverages affect and exercise and all sorts of things, how they affect my blood sugar.
Right.
And then avoid those things that,
Yeah.
and you know, in some cases, really interesting results where like one thing could blunt the negative effect of my blood sugar going up, so that I could modify my own, you know, my own habits.
Well, when I ask women to do a glucose test in pregnancy, right, I decided what I'm going to do is I'm going to do, if they don't want to do the sugar test because they hate drinking that stuff, I'm going to have them do blood sugars for 2 weeks, fasting blood sugars for 2 weeks. So I decided, well, if I'm going to make them do that, I'm going to do it. So I did. Guess what? A non-fat latte does have sugar.
It sure does.
Yeah, hello. So there's my take home.
Unfortunately.
Yes, exactly. Everything you
Unfortunately.
ingest makes a difference.
Okay,
Okay.
Well, that's the end of the questions,
Yes.
and we're coming up to the end of the hour. I wanted to just let everyone know that we are, you know, we're calling this the Reproductive Longevity and Equality Initiatives at the Buck Institute. So we have the center, which is physically here at the Buck, staffed with scientists working on this problem. We have the consortium, which is a global initiative, but they're both focused around trying to understand what's happening during ovarian aging and to advance the science. So we did put together a fund for anyone who's interested in donating. There's a QR code on your screen right now. And if you want to help us out, please do. If you don't, that's also totally fine. We'll be back next month on December 2nd. And at that point, I'm going to be talking with the CEO of EverNow, Alicia Jackson, who is a spectacular scientist. She's also doing what I think is really exciting work in the menopause, perimenopause, and hormone replacement therapy space.
Exactly.
So
Fantastic.
stay tuned.
Yes.
And thank you for watching.
Yes.